The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on the account of sex. The 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, claims to protect the right to vote regardless of gender, the demand for which began with the abolitionist movement and was strengthened by the feminist movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Women such as Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucretia Mott are often considered as the primary leaders of the women's suffrage movement and as the women who most prominently contributed to the amendment's ratification. However, the significance that men and women of color had is often overlooked. The predominant narrative concerning the 19th Amendment focuses on the influence that white female suffragists had, but excludes others equally as impactful in the fight within the frontier of gender equality. It was only through the diverse demand for the franchise that the amendment was passed. The activism of women of all races was crucial for gaining the right to vote, though most still face voting restrictions following its ratification. While ratifying the 19th Amendment presented a historic milestone, it is imperative to recognize that it was only passed due to the collective demand for gender equality, regardless of race, frontiers we still face today. The 15th Amendment states, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on the account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." Whereas the 13th outlawed slavery and the 14th granted African American citizenship, the 15th Amendment enfranchised African American men. Before its passage, most suffragists and abolitionists fought for both causes simultaneously. Not until after its ratification did suffragists such as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton split away from the abolitionist movement to focus solely on women's suffrage, as they argued that race issues were separate from women's issues. African American suffragist Frances Ellen Watkins Harbor recorded, "When it was a question of race, I let the lesser question of sex go, but the white women all go for sex, letting race occupy a minor position." Suffragists like Anthony and Stanton thought women deserved the franchise before or at the same time as black men, and often used racist sentiments to appeal to white legislators, arguing that the enfranchisement of white women would ensure the political majority. On May 15, 1869, Anthony and Stanton formed the National Women's Suffrage Association, which opposed the American Women's Suffrage Association founded the following November. In 1890, both organizations combined to form the National American Women's Suffrage Association, as it was only together that they would gather enough support for the amendment's ratification. Whereas political opposition came from concerns regarding control, those who disagreed with suffrage feared the disruption of the domestic sphere. In a pamphlet distributed within New York in 1913, anti-suffragist Alice Hill Chittenden argued, "I believe we would lose immeasurably, for we would then become but another spoke in the wheel of political machinery." Although anti-suffragists thought that women would accomplish more if they worked outside of the political sphere, suffragists believed that lasting social reform could only be achieved through voting, and therefore women needed the right to do so. For nearly a century, suffragists fought against prejudice and the assumption of female dependence to achieve gender equality, a frontier that had not been challenged before. Although white suffragists saw the 19th Amendment's passage as a monumental shift, suffragists of color saw it as an incremental step towards gaining universal equality for forthcoming generations, as the legislation they were fighting for would not end up protecting the right to vote. Despite advocating for the same ideals, white women frequently excluded women of different races from the suffrage events they hosted. Directors of the 1913 Women's Suffrage Procession advised African American supporters to only march if they marched in the back. African American suffragist Ida B. Wells Barnett refused and marched with her state's delegation in the front. She told her other members, "Either I go with you or not at all. I am not taking the stand because I personally wish recognition. I am doing it for the future benefit of my whole race." Native American suffragist Marie Louise Bottineau Baldwin used the press at these events to inform the public of Native American culture, arguing that Indian women were among some of the first suffragists, since women participated in politics within certain tribes. Advocates like Baldwin and Zachariah Shaw had to fight for the legal recognition of Native Americans as U.S. citizens before they could fight for the right to vote. Their experiences as children, forced to assimilate into a culture they did not identify with, inspired their leadership and activism as they lobbied Congress and worked in Washington, D.C., monumental for both societal and legal reform. Native Americans were not the only individuals who fought for the right to vote without the promise of being able to do so once the amendment was ratified. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 banned Chinese immigrants such as Mabel Pingwa Li from obtaining U.S. citizenship. It was the first time the United States had barred anyone from entering its borders. However, this did not hinder or prevent Li's suffrage efforts. At age 16, Mabel Pingwa Li rode horseback as she led the 1912 Fifth Avenue Parade, with a sign that read "Catching Up with China." Li wanted to help her, more restricted American sisters, gain the same political equality she had experienced before immigrating to the United States. The 19th Amendment would be passed 8 years after the 1912 parade, but it would be another 23 years until Chinese men and women like Li could apply for U.S. citizenship and cast an American ballot. In order to expand suffrage efforts, the National American Women's Suffrage Association began to focus on the southern states, as resistance to the franchise was particularly prevalent in the South. Ovidia Idar, a Mexican-American activist in Texas, often faced adversity as she spoke out in favor of women's rights, against racial discrimination, and about the importance of Mexican culture. Throughout her journalism career, she wrote pro-suffrage articles and criticized the U.S. government, resulting in an attempt by the Texas Rangers to destroy the publication she wrote for. Ovidia Idar fought to be heard during a time when others were silenced through violence and oppression. She worked to involve more Mexican-American women in the fight for suffrage, and founded the League of Mexican Women in 1911, one of the first known Latina feminist organizations. "Women, proudly raise your chins and face the fight," she urged. "The time of your degradation has passed. Women are no longer men's servants, but their equals." Both suffrage and anti-suffrage efforts continued to increase significantly within the South. However, due to advocates like Ovidia Idar, Texas became the first southern state to vote to ratify the 19th Amendment. Although women of color worked as much as possible within the broader suffrage movement, women's clubs began to form throughout the United States and became a crucial part of the fight. Ida B. Wells stated that women's organizations were the new power, the new mold of public sentiment to accomplish the reforms that the pulpit and the law have failed to do. Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, the Women's Air Club founder, strived to unite these organizations that would eventually converge and become the National Association of Colored Women, founded with the motto, "Lifting as we climb." The New York Times wrote that this was the first movement of the kind ever attempted. On August 18, 1920, Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment, assuring that the right to vote will not be divested to anyone based on sex. It marked one of the most significant voting rights expansions in U.S. history, developing the frontier of gender equality. While white women were then allowed to vote in federal elections, not all women could do the same. Marie Louise Bottineau Baldwin and Sitkala Shaw diligently advocated for the Native American Citizenship Act passed in 1924. However, even after its passage, it took over 40 years for every state to allow Native Americans to vote. The Chinese Exclusion Repeal Act of 1943 re-allowed Chinese immigration. It is unknown if Mabel Pingwa Li ever obtained U.S. citizenship or if she ever cast an American ballot. What is known is how she supported the amendment's ratification, and how her ideals of equality continue to encourage change despite nationality or immigration status. Voting rights were not protected for African Americans until the 1960s. They still struggle to vote, especially those in lower socioeconomic classes, due to various methods of voter disenfranchisement and Jim Crow laws in the South.
And so the first election that they had after the bill passed, the white women were going to vote, and we dressed up and went to vote. And when we got on there, well, we couldn't vote. They gave us all different kind of excuses why. We just stayed. We asked, we wanted to know why we couldn't vote. The answers to the questions were so invalid, we were not satisfied. So finally one woman, Mrs. Simmons, said, "Are you saying that we can't vote because we are Negroes?" And he said, "Yes, Negroes don't vote in primary in Texas."
The Voting Rights Act of 1965, signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson, supported the objectives of the 15th Amendment and prohibited poll taxes, literacy tests, and intimidation at the polls, which increased voter registration and participation from historically marginalized populations.
Today, what is perhaps the last of the legal barriers is tumbling, and there will be many actions and many difficulties before the rights woven into law are also woven into the fabric of our nation.
Still, the fight for equal voting rights continues today. The 2013 Supreme Court case Shelby County v. Holder struck down key portions of the Voting Rights Act, empowering local officials to change voting laws without federal oversight. Over 25 states changed their laws within 5 years, making voting more difficult. These state laws enacted stricter voter identification requirements, closed polling stations, limited voting hours, and placed new restrictions on absentee voting, reducing participation specifically within low-income and under-resourced communities. In the 2021 Supreme Court case Brnovich v. Democratic National Committee, the court narrowly interpreted Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, making it more difficult to challenge discriminatory voting bills in the future. Often untold within the predominant narrative surrounding the 19th Amendment is the influence women of color had in achieving the promise and potential of its ratification. Although few of these women experienced how they truly changed society, they were pioneers within the broad frontier of equality. Through advocating for change, their activism led to one of the most considerable achievements in women's history, the right to vote, regardless of race or gender. Frontiers we still face today.